Okay, we should be live. Should be good on sound. We will see in a moment. Please hit the like button. All right. Should be a good stream tonight. Um, Not too intense, but definitely interesting. We're going to discuss a very interesting figure in physics. One in which I am going by how everybody else says her name, which is Sabine, but it seems to be spelled Sabine, but I'm not German, at least not you know in this generation. So, Sabine Hossenfelder or Sabine Hossenfelder. Um, but I can't tell if it's Sabine and everybody is just too and she's just too kind to correct anyone, or if it is Sabine. I mean, if it is Sabine and she's just too kind to correct anyone, or if it is genuinely Sabine. But if anybody knows, comment. But if I botch anybody's name ever, my apologies. But she is a physicist and German physicist. She's very vocal in the not just the physics community, but I would say the scientific community at large. She's got a lot of not controversial, but contrarian opinions, I would say, which is always, I think, a good thing if as long as it's directed, and I think that it is. But she has a YouTube channel that is extremely popular, which we're going to explore. She also, I recently found out, studied at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where I'm from, another one. That place is very popular, it seems. I mean, I knew that. It is a great school, if there is a great school. I'm not a whoa, let me fix this. Collar problems going on. It's a it is it's a great school if there is a great school, but I'm not a huge fan of the academic university system, as many of you know. And I'm very familiar with the University of Arizona, and I'm a fan as far as universities go, but that doesn't make me a fan of universities at all. But it was still cool to see. So she recently went on Brian Keating's YouTube channel. We've gone over many different interviews that Brian Keating has done. I wasn't sure exactly which interview of Sabine or Sabina's most recent interviews on many channels that she has done, because she has recently released a book. I was going to discuss, but this one with Brian hit on a lot of topics, and I think it was very specific, and so I chose this one. I looked at a few others, but they were just not as, I don't know, not as specific and not as organized. But her recent book is the title of this live stream, which is Existential Physics. I have not read it, and I probably won't, to be honest. But I might one day. Who knows? Let's see. Penguin Random House. This is it. And it is called Existential Physics, A Scientist's Guide to Life's Biggest Questions. And it's got a butterfly on the front. Very nice looking book. You can get it at all these places. I highly recommend checking it out, even though I haven't read it. But I know that Sabine has very interesting thoughts, and maybe one day I will read it. But I don't do a whole lot of like book reading, even though I am constantly reading. I read all day long, every day. I am learning about all kinds of things, but it's usually not from books anymore. It was when I was a kid, but then the internet showed up, and now I just read on the internet. But this is her YouTube channel, and it's called Science Without the Gobbledygook. She has 530,000 subscribers, which is a lot. I don't normally comment too much on people's subscriber count because that's just not very relevant, but that is a lot. And I was looking at her videos because I was like, wow, that is really a lot. How'd she do that? She has fascinating topics here. I have not gone through most of these. I don't even remember looking at that one. It probably just went and played after another video that I had seen. But I will definitely be going through these at some point, and we'll talk more about them. Pseudoscience, always an interesting topic. Is math real? Was the universe made for us? How bad is plastic? That's a great question. I'm very curious. Does the past still exist? What's the difference between a brain and a computer? Is quantum physics really weird? The best scientific hoaxes. I'd be curious to see that too. I mean, these are great topics. The second quantum revolution. 5G. I'm curious to see what she has to say about 5G. They just put up a 5G tower near me. Warp drives. It's great. It's got a lot of her interviews down here, and a lot of explanation type of videos, short types of videos. Did the W boson break the standard model? Interesting. Okay, well, lots of great content there, but we'll talk more about it. This is Brian Keating's channel. As I've said before, I've worked with Brian, and I really like Brian a lot. I really am a big fan of his channel as well. I do recommend subscribing to both of their channels. I can do that because I've watched enough of both of their videos to be able to say that confidently, despite not having read their books. And they both have written, pretty prominent books. But this is the stream that we are going to be discussing right here, Existential Physics.
If God plays a role in their life.
Okay, and slowly computer is coming back. Okay, and so this is her background though. Sabine Hossenfelder, or Sabine, is a German theoretical physicist, author, and musician who researches quantum gravity. She is a research fellow at the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies, where she leads the superfluid dark matter group. She is the author of Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray. She's very famous for that idea, basically proposing that beauty is distracting to physicists. I have my thoughts on that I've shared. Which explores the elegance in fundamental physics and cosmology, and now also existential physics, this book, which is the topic of the stream that we are going to look over. Let's see here. It says here, she moved to North America and completed her research fellowships at the University of Arizona. Almost my alma mater, but not. University of California, Santa Barbara, Perimeter Institute in Canada, and the Nordida Institute for Theoretical Physics in Sweden. And I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. She argued against free will and in favor of superdeterminism. We are going to talk a little bit about that tonight later on, and what it really means. I'm not an expert on it though, but we're just kind of going to go over it. So without further ado, please hit the like button. Like I said, it really helps us with the algorithm. If you are watching, I would really appreciate it. And I will get started on the first clip of this stream. So this is just kind of my general thoughts. As I've said before, this is not meant to usually be a critique. It's not meant to usually be a negative, I guess negative. I'm not trying to just fight people who aren't even in front of me. I usually share streams that I think are important and interesting, and this is one of them. It's not the most groundbreaking stream. There's a lot. I've covered other streams with Sabine or Sabina that I think are more, I guess, monumental. I don't know, but this is still a good one, and I think that her book is one that, even though I have not read it, I have looked into what it is about and what of the many statements in it, and I think that it's starting to touch on some very important issues, and that idea is very important, and of what those issues are, and we're going to talk about that most of this stream, because there are some topics that physicists continue to deny have to do with physics, but somehow cannot stop talking about, and we are going to get into some of those a bit. So, without further ado, first clip. Every now and then I am critical, and it's usually, if it's not about like the dogma against consciousness's central role in quantum physics, which I think it has a central role in pretty much every field of study, I would say, but I am very critical of that, the dogma against that idea, and I am also very critical of a few other things involving academia and scientific community in general that are not really about specific ideas. There's no point in just attacking without purpose, and so I'm not here to cause drama. If you're new to this channel, but I don't know. I am thinking about starting a little bit of contention later this stream. We'll see, but not about exactly this stream. But still, we'll see. You guys are lucky.
Decried the situation of how, physics is being almost overarchingly taken over by this love of beauty and symmetry and organization, and thanks to math. And then this is kind of, things are blowing apart, the butterflies separating the chaotic nature, which is closer to reality, of course. And so, yes, and the subtitle is A Scientist's Guide to Life's Biggest Questions. And the commonality between these two books, your two books, is that you're kind of a heroine in your own story. One of my episodes with you is called The Heroine's Journey, because you go around the world in all your books kind of like a journalist. And I thought we would start there, if you don't mind, talking about how you come to interview these phenomenal scientists and authors, Zia Morali, Sir Roger Penrose, to David Deutsch, etc. But the first question you asked them, Sabina, was very surprising to me. You always ask them if God plays a role in their life. Why did you ask that question?
I've asked this question a lot of physicists, and I find it interesting that most of them answer. So what I ask them is, "Are you religious?" That's the way that I put it, and they'll always say, "No, but." And then after the but, there's the interesting part, and this is what I wanted to get to. The only person who didn't do this was David Deutsch, who was just like, no.
And Zia Morelli, of course, she embraces God. She's not a scientist anymore. She did train at my alma mater, Brown University, for some time, and I do hope to have her on the podcast as well. But she's a devout Muslim, and she does practice, as you say. You're coming off the interview with her, coming off of Ramadan. So I thought that was interesting. But actually, throughout the book has many topics, and it's interesting how much physics has come full circle. In other words, it used to be people like Galileo and certainly Newton and maybe even Einstein, although we can get into that, had this, kind of overarching impact of religion on their life. Sabina, a lot of the conversations that revolve around God, unfortunately, a lot of what people end up saying is basically some kind of, in my opinion, warmed over version of either I don't believe in it or I'm agnostic, which I used to leave open as a question if my audience, if my guest would say that. For example, my first guest, Freeman Dyson, on the podcast way back 4 or 5 years ago, he said, I'm agnostic, but it's a great mystery and I love doing it. And I said, that's great, Freeman, but what do you do practically? How do you distinguish your daily life from that of an atheist? In other words, if a super intelligent alien looked at you, he would say, you don't go to the same church that Richard Dawkins doesn't go to. And so I'm wondering, how do you react when people, do you ever have this notion that they're not being either intellectually honest or that they really just don't want to come out and say I'm an atheist, or they don't want to come out and say, as Stephen Hawking said, that would cut book sales, in half more than adding equations. Do you ever get the sense that they're kind of modulating their belief or lack thereof in a god or in a religion to either sell books or for some other purpose?
Well, I would put myself into the same camp. Like, I would say that for what my research is concerned, I would say I'm agnostic. This is also what I write in the book. Like, I don't take sides. I don't know one way or the other. But if you're asking about the way that I lead my personal life, I'm not religious. I don't go to church. So for practical purposes, you can call me an atheist. Right? So this is the way that people think about atheists. Right. So I don't know how other people do it. I often get the sense that scientists, physicists, which is the kind of scientists that I mostly deal with, they kind of replace this religious element that they've taken out of their life by some other kind of belief. There could be a multiverse, or it could be the beauty of natural laws, or whatever you have to.
Okay, lots to discuss there. Actually, this might be a much more fascinating stream to discuss than I originally thought. I didn't think it would be not fascinating. I just thought, there are, whenever Sabine is in a lot of almost like debates and panel discussions that we've gone over in the past with Eric Weinstein and a number of other people, and they are, I think, just always interesting because you have lots of different people's opinions going on, more so than just discussing a book. But it's the book's topics, like I said, were very important, and so this might be more. I don't want to say more interesting, but just more engaging than I had originally thought. But so there's a lot to break down in this. For one, why is it that physicists cannot avoid God as a topic? Okay, if God was truly detached from physics, then why does it keep coming up? That's like the same thing with consciousness. And they're the same exact topic, by the way. They're just like, how are you thinking about it? Are you thinking about it in a hierarchy, or are you thinking about it outside of a hierarchy as just a phenomenon? That's the difference. But they're the same exact topic. And is consciousness fundamental? If consciousness is fundamental to the universe, then or to existence, then God exists. God is, by definition, the existence as a sentient being. It's himself, like itself. The totality of existence as a singular sentient being. That is God, and there is no other definition of God that matters. There's details that you can get into that you could argue, and that's fine. But as far as what is the definition of God, God is the singular sentience that is existence itself, and you could say also the highest being in the hierarchy of decision, and that's it, basically. The creator of the cosmos. I mean, those three things, I would say, are the defining characteristics of God. The first one is the overarching definition, and then the other two are kind of like about how we relate to him morally and also physically, you could say. So we relate to him morally within a hierarchy. We relate to him physically in that he is the creator of multiplicity of sentience. And his own definition is that he is the singular sentience that is existence itself. So that is God. Every other definition of God is not a definition worthy of being called God if the word God has a specific and important definition. So that's just a fact, and that is logically deducible. It's not something that I'm just saying because that's what I want. It's any other definition will define God to possibly be something that isn't the totality of existence as a sentient being, or isn't the highest being in the hierarchy, or isn't the creator of everything. And if God isn't those things specifically, then it's just a higher being than us, but not necessarily the highest being. And if it's not the highest being, or the fundamental being, then it is not worthy, I would say, of being called God. I mean, what are you going to call that? You're going to call something lower than that God, and then something higher than that, like a different name? It just doesn't make sense. So if God is a label that has meaning at all and should even exist, that is the definition of God. Creator of the cosmos, so from multiplicity of consciousness, that is the highest being in the decision hierarchy and is existence, the totality of existence itself as a singular sentience. So, but physicists constantly describe themselves as atheists, and I used to do this too. I was a diehard atheist. I was self-described atheist. I would describe myself now, back then, as an anti-theist, but I am now not an atheist or an anti-theist or an agnostic. I'm a theist. And but I think that there's only theism and anti-theism. I don't think that there is agnosticism. And I don't think that there is atheism. Brian is asking is highlighting exactly the problem with this, is that what is atheism versus agnosticism? They're just different in how you want to say them. One of them is you don't want to piss anyone off, where you call yourself an agnostic. The other one is you don't care if you piss anybody off, you call yourself an atheist. Both are incorrect. You can only be a theist and an anti-theist, or an anti-theist. A theist is you believe the existence is a singular sentient being that is the highest being in decision and created multiplicity. Or you are an anti-theist, in which you believe that consciousness is not fundamental to existence and that it is emergent from matter, essentially, and from unconscious inanimate matter, and that there's many different places that goes, but it usually goes to moral relativism and just a belief in kind of a clock type of universe, without a creator, that is this functional machine, but isn't a being. So, but that is the belief that is not a belief of lacking belief in sentient existence, which is what atheism is supposed to mean. If you ask an atheist who is like really into atheism, like Sam Harris or something, atheism, let's look this up. The disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods, So there's many issues with this definition that make it wrong, actually, but also, partially correct. One, there cannot be gods. There cannot. God, by definition, is the highest being, is the totality of existence, is a sentient being, and is the creator of all. There cannot be gods. If there are multiple gods, then we have to have a different name for them, or maybe you could call them lowercase, G gods versus uppercase G God. Maybe you could do that, but you cannot have gods, multiple gods, as being equal and if they're not equal, then why don't you just call the highest one God? It doesn't make really sense, but whatever. And then the first part of the definition that doesn't make sense, though, which is the disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. These two things, this versus this, are not the same thing. You cannot actually have this about the nature of the universe because you interact with the universe every day. You can have this about things that you don't interact with, like Bigfoot. Like if you don't have any opinion on Bigfoot or QAnon or like any kind of theory that is not interacted with every single day, then you could have a lack of belief about it. I don't have a belief in QAnon. I don't even really know what QAnon really means. I have friends that believe in QAnon, friends that think QAnon is crazy. I don't have a belief in it. I have a lack of belief. It's a lack of opinion. It's really what it is. It's not that I disbelieve, but you can't do that with the nature of the universe where you're like, well, I just don't have an opinion on whether or not the universe is sentient. What do you mean? You interact with it every day. Of course you have an opinion. That doesn't mean you're very strongly opinionated about it, but you have an assumption. And so you cannot be an atheist if it means lack of belief. If it means disbelief, yes, you can be an atheist, but that's why I call it an anti-theist, because it makes it simple as to what it really means. So an anti-theist would be a lack of belief, or it would be a disbelief in God, or a disbelief in the idea that consciousness is fundamental to existence. Which one of them, the idea that consciousness is fundamental to existence, is like the precursor belief to realizing theism. But theism is the inevitability of consciousness being fundamental to existence, but it isn't thought about as theism when people are just like, saying I'm a panpsychist. If you're a panpsychist, you're a theist. But you just don't, or I won't say you are a theist, but panpsychism is a precursor belief to theism, because theism is the inevitable result of the assumption of panpsychism. So I don't like the word atheism because it implies an absence. That's means like absence. So like atheism is absent of the idea of theism, but it's used to mean disbelief. If you watch Sam Harris or I don't know, Richard Dawkins or any of these people who are kind of leaders in the so-called atheist community, they would call, when you corner them and you're like, you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, you disbelieve in God, and they're like, no, I have a lack of belief. And then they'll go on and say that belief in God is, stupid or something, and it's like, that means you disbelieve in God, okay? You don't actually have a lack of belief. They're kind of having their cake and eating it too, and don't let them, because it doesn't make sense. So, but if you look up agnosticism, I do like the term agnosticism, but not when it comes to God. I like it when it comes to QAnon. You could say I'm agnostic when it comes to QAnon or Bigfoot, but you cannot, you can't say I'm atheist when it comes to QAnon, because it built into the word atheism is theism, and this is not about theism if it's about QAnon or Bigfoot. But agnosticism is a word that has a lot of value. It just means like, I don't really know. I have no real opinion that's strong enough to mention. So what is the concept of agnosticism? A person who holds the view that any ultimate reality, such as God, is unknown and probably unknowable broadly. One who is not committed to believing in either the existence or the non-existence of God. It's usually attributed to God, but it doesn't have to be. Or is unwilling to commit to an opinion about something being like political agnostic. So that's why it's not only attributable to God. That's why agnosticism is a word that is useful, but it's not useful in the context of God. It's useful in the context of everything else, literally everything else, but not God. And I mean, almost everything else. Anything else that isn't something that you have to do and interact with every single day, but especially, the universe. But atheism is a stupid word. It's a bad word, and I've talked about bad words on here a lot, and bad questions. And a bad word is not a curse word. It's a word that is has a meaning associated with it that doesn't actually exist, like atheism. And bad questions are questions that don't actually have an answer that is true. Which is like, how did life begin? Kind of like that kind of question. And we'll talk about that later, but because it does come up in this. But I think that Brian is saying that he thinks that they're just a lot of these physicists are being non-committal, and I think that is true. Most of them are not being very committed to their answers, and part of that is because the problem with the word atheism. Another part of that is because of they are probably, if they're, a thinking person, maybe slightly afraid of completely disavowing God, just in case. They're kind of hedging their bets. And they also, though, there is this incentive within the scientific community, and I know this for a fact because I've been there. I was a biology major, and I was, called myself an atheist, to be identifying as an atheist. If you're not an atheist and you are involved in this hard natural sciences, I guess you could say, what are called the hard natural sciences, you are labeled as the moron, essentially. But the reality is that you are labeled that even outside of that. I remember my first philosophy class that I ever took, first and only. The one girl in the class the two best people in the class, and two most engaged people in the class were me and this one girl. And I would have called myself an atheist at the time, but I was really starting to just see that there was more. And it was like the same year I had kind of the beginning of a theophany, but it wasn't quite there. And I just was seeing that there was more to the universe because I was exploring perspective, and so I wasn't as dogmatic as I had been in the past, but I was still a self-described atheist, and I would have been actually still an anti-theist. But this other girl in the class that was still very good at philosophy she was a theist, and she was a Christian. I think so. I imagine. And she was mocked in the class whenever she would bring God into the equation. Not by me. I would actually stick up for her as best I could. I couldn't very well because I was not a theist, but I found myself for the first time just feeling for somebody who was at the other end of that dogma. And I used to be somebody who would not care. I would be like, why do mock away, because who let the the moron into the class. I'm not that bad, but still, like, I thought that the idea that God was just like a stuffed animal that people cling to comfort them at night. And I will say this: since becoming a theist, I find the idea of God to be it is at least equally concerning as it is comforting, which I would say actually isn't necessarily like the best way to look at it. I think it should be slightly more comforting than it is concerning, but it's also very concerning to me. And it should be at least partially concerning to you if you are a theist. It implies moral, moral truths that we have to reconcile ourselves with, which is uncomfortable. But why is it that the very first question, though, that Sabine asks these scientists is, about the relationship with God? There's so much cognitive dissonance, I feel like, in people who want to divorce the idea of God from science or consciousness from physics, but then cannot stop talking about it themselves. It's like, why can't you just leave it alone? Because you can't leave it alone. It's just impossible to leave it alone because it is the foundation of reality. I think that asking the question, are you religious, which is the question that she asked them, is not the best question to ask. The most devout theists that I know would not describe themselves as religious, usually, or at least they would want to explain what that meant, even though outsiders would definitely call them religious. I'm not really sure exactly what it means to be religious. And I keep kosher still. But I think a better question would be, do you believe that the universe or existence is a single sentient being? Or do you believe that sentience emerges from, inanimate matter naturally? Or inevitably, I guess you could say, or randomly? It doesn't really matter the specificities, but if it's emergent is the point. That's a better question than are you religious? Religion implies like usually a scripture and also a set of practices associated with that scripture and communities associated with that scripture. And there's nothing wrong with that either. I myself, hold scriptures to be in high regard, multiple actually, and he talked about her interviewing a devout Muslim woman who was, involved in scientific academic community at least at some point. I think that I believe the Quran is divinely inspired and that Muhammad was legitimate prophet. I have no issues with that meshing with scientific pursuits, but but that doesn't mean that I think that they are the same in their methodology either. They're not. Scripture is not science, but it's like a cheat code almost. And I mean that in a positive sense, not in a negative sense. It's like if you don't want to have to sit there and try and deduce the reality of every, bit of, future predictions and moral, moral conundrums and stuff, then, there's scripture for that. But you can also, I think, do it through first principles logical analysis for the most part. Not all of it necessarily, but actually probably most of it. It's religion is different than God. To be a theist, theism is my fundamental belief. Like, if you ask me, what is your belief system? I am a theist. And that means I believe there is a singular sentience that is the totality of existence. That being is the highest in the hierarchy of decision, and that being is the creator of all multiplicity of consciousness, or the cosmos, you could say. Beyond that, you can get specific, but that is to be a theist. To be, that you can be a theist and a Muslim. If you are Muslim, then you are a theist. You could be a theist and believe in, the in Judaism, which is also, a theistic theological tradition. It is a theological tradition, and then you can, be a Christian. That's also a theological tradition, and there's also other scriptures out there that I would say are legitimate, but that is different. Your association with those scriptures is different than being. It's more specific than being a theist. It is kind of like religious, if you could call it religious, but the word religion just has so many preconceived assumptions attached to it that it's not one that I like to use, or any other devout, theist that I know. So it's a bad question to ask, I would say, for Sabine to ask. It's a better question to ask, are you a theist? And do you believe, what that means is, do you believe that existence is a sentient being? Probably even better question to ask, because it's so specific. And you won't get this yes, but answer that she says a lot of these people gave, except for David Deutsch, who gave a no answer, which is funny because I'm pretty sure he is the creator of constructor theory, which comes very close to being theism, to sounding like theism at least, even though it's not theism. And there's a flaw in it that I would say is because it's not theism. I mean, if constructor theory it's the theory of machines, but not the maker or user of those machines. It's like the theory of machines. As a constructor is not God in constructor theory. A constructor is like a robot on an assembly line. So, but I do think that, physicists do use God, mentioning of God, to sell books. I also think that they just don't want to completely detach from that idea. They're trying to associate that idea with like the highest reality, and also they are personifying the universe a bit when they start looking at the beauty and symmetry found in mathematics. They start to personify it. That doesn't mean that you actually go all the way there, but it's starting. And like Brian said, there's an aspect of that too. So I don't know what the specific motivations of each person would be, but it's probably multiple, of the various ones that I just listed. They don't want to piss off God if God exists. They don't want to, they want to sell books because the God, saying the God particle, calling your book the God particle, everybody's going to be like, what about this particle is so amazing? Because that makes it the God particle, or the God equation. What makes the God equation the God equation? It's the equation of all equations. And it is used to convey like the ultimateness of some idea, particle, or equation, whatever. But I think that it's wrong to use the word God if you're not implying sentience. Like God is a specifically defined being. Like I said, it's not even a thing; it's a being. And if you don't believe in that, don't use it to sell books. And I think we need to get past using the word agnostic when it comes to God, and I think we need to get past using the word atheism or atheist, because there's only theism and anti-theism, and that's it. you can be a very strong theist, like me. That doesn't mean I act as a strong theist. There are people that act more in alignment with religious, traditions than I do, and they don't actually believe that God exists. I know of Orthodox Hasidic Jews that were technically would have called themselves atheists, but they liked their life in it. They grew up in that culture and they continued to act that way. And that's far more, biblically adherent than my, way of believing, my way of acting now, even though my belief is not belief. I don't even like the word belief. I don't believe in God. I don't know what that means to believe in God or believe, I guess, you could believe in some things that you're not sure about, but I know God exists. And people will say, "Oh, how could you know?" There's multiple reasons. You could disbelieve in my knowing. That's fine, but and that's totally fine. You don't have if you don't take my word for that. By the way, if I say God exists, I'm aware of God's existence. Don't take my word for it. If you don't already, have a belief in God, in the existence of God, and some people I would say belief might be the right way to put it, but not for me. I don't think that word works for me. Or some people might say I'm aware of God. Many people say that. I'm in that camp. If you are not already aware of or believing in God, do not take my word for it. If what I'm saying makes logical sense to you when I'm describing sentient singularity theory, then sure. Maybe you should start to, do some personal investigation about your beliefs. But you should not take my word for any of this unless you see it to be true. But it is funny. This topic keeps coming up. Why is it the first question in your book? Why is an agnostic with no opinion asking this question? It just doesn't make sense. Because agnosticism doesn't exist when it comes to God. Like I said, please hit the like button if you are watching this and you haven't yet. And please comment in the chat any questions that you might have, and we'll go to the next question. I'm going to try and keep this well under 2 hours because we did start late. So, but what's interesting is that Brian, in this clip, he's talking about how all these scientists of the past had such a strong belief in God, and now almost none of them do. In fact, we're going to look at this next clip. He says 93%, over 93% of all physicists, I believe, answered that they do not believe in God, or that they disbelieve in God.
But there are certain similarities, and yes, you bring this up when you talk about things like the simulation hypothesis, etc. And what do you make of the fact that so many scientists were religious, even 100 years ago, but now very few? I mean, in the U.S., 93% of the National Academy of Science does not believe or actively does not profess a belief in God, at least here. I don't know what it is like in Germany or Europe. But what do you make of this huge, that's a huge phase transition from almost 100% universal belief to 7% at best. What do you attribute that to?
Well, to be honest, I think it's a mistake that the traditional churches, like the big churches, make. Like basically here, almost all people are either Protestants or they're Catholic, and they hold on very closely to these very traditional stories, which, if you think about them too much, they don't really make a lot of sense. And I think this is what put me off from church. So I actually went to church for quite some time, when I was a teenager, because I was interested in it, and I liked the singing. There was free food and that kind of stuff. And to be honest, I like the social get-together, which at the end of my book I say that science leaves me wanting in that regard. We could do better when it comes to the social aspect. But I think it's kind of unnecessary, right? There's key elements to this belief, which I think people find attractive, and it expresses something that they care about, which doesn't hinge on the literal interpretation of certain phrases in the Bible, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so there's lots to unpack there. This is actually a fascinating stream. For one, I don't think that she is correct when she says that it is the fault of the religious communities that we no longer believe in science, or that we know that we have divorced science from theology, essentially, or that it is because the failure to adjust terminology by the religious communities that is the problem for it no longer being adopted as a belief, or that theism is no longer prevalent among scientists. I think that it's more complicated than that. First of all, I think that a big part of this is actually on the fault of universities, and that but it is partially on the fault of institutional, theological traditions and the institutions of theological traditions that they have not, until more recently, been as engaged with the scientific world. And they used to be. I mean, the main funder of science for so long were theological, the institutions of theological traditions, the church, the temple, all these institutions that are built on the backbone of the idea of theism, and the devotion to God. They used to be the entities that were pushing science forward, and they stopped being that for a while. And I think that part of that is because of misinterpretations by the scientific community of the implications of certain ideas like evolution and certain cosmological theories and stuff like that, and that basically you could only be a theist or you could believe in evolution. Okay, when I first met my wife, and she had just become, my girlfriend. And at the time, this was like 7 years ago, almost 6 years ago. And well over 6 years ago, I remember we were making dinner in the kitchen, and I have a bunch of snakes, and I breed them for different colors, and I have a bunch of geckos over there, and I'm breeding those as well. There's like, I don't even know, 20 eggs or something like that sitting on my desk incubating right now. And so I'm very familiar with genetics and inheritance and adaptation and things like that. It's a big part of my life. It's not one that I just believe in because of school. It's one that I apply. I'm literally taking a snake and turning it white and I have black ones and white ones and orange ones, and like I use Punnett squares to predict the outcome of those breedings. Like, I know genetics in a practical sense. I interact with it. I make predictions about it, and then I see the results of those predictions. I apply those Punnett squares that we used to do in grade school. I do that every year. I apply those. And so I can't deny many of these processes that we are taught in biology. And so I remember once I was speaking to my girlfriend at the time, now wife, who was a Christian and is a Christian. and first true theist that I had ever dated. And I remember being like, so do you believe that God created the universe, or do you believe in evolution? And she was like, both. And I was like, whoa, those two ideas are not mutually exclusive. I've never in 4 years of my life entertained that idea that those two ideas were not mutually exclusive. When I was about to be bar mitzvahed, my rabbi asked me if I believed in God. I was 13 years old, and I said, no, this is all nonsense. And I'm going through the motions for the sake of, my parents, and the challenge of, learning a portion of the Torah. And he said, how do you know God doesn't exist? And I said, because in the Bible it says that God created the world in 7 days or 6 days, and I know that, through fossil records that life has been around quite a bit longer than that. And he was like, well, what if one day to God is not the same as one day to us? And I was like, that's just a cop-out and stupid. And there's no way of reconciling that into anything that matters to me. And that's not actually that much of a cop-out, but I do understand it's not really that great of an explanation. A better explanation would have been, Tyler, actually the Torah in its original language of Hebrew, day, the word for day is yom, and yom actually means period. It doesn't mean day as in 24-hour day necessarily. It could be that, but it could also mean something else. So essentially, really what the Bible says is God created, the world in 6 periods and then rested on the 7th period. It doesn't say day necessarily. And I didn't know that, though, until I was much older. And so and that makes much more sense with sentient singularity theory. And what I believe, is how that relates, I believe, to Bott periodicity in mathematics, like this. But that is different than just this literal interpretation. It's not always meant to be a literal interpretation. Sometimes it's meant to be metaphorical. Sometimes it's super literal in how the scripture is meant to be interpreted. There's multiple layers of how of interpretation that are all considered true, and then also you have to factor in the fact that translation leaves out a lot of information, and so you don't really know what these things are saying. But there's many things that have led to this divergence between theism and science. And I think that actually when you divorce theism from science, you can't actually have true science anymore, which sounds crazy if you are, somebody who was raised in this time like me, but there are reasons why that's the case, and it has to do with the fact that goals direct everything that we do. They contextualize everything that we do. They contextualize our endeavors and things, and they contextualize science. And you need a goal in order to contextualize science well enough to do good science, and the context of that goal can only be in the context of theism, because outside of theism there is no goal. It's just whatever you want. It's like create your own meaning, essentially. And which I don't even know if that's a good word or a good phrase or a bad phrase, but like this idea of like there is no purpose to any of this, and just have fun, and or you just become nihilistic. So you become nihilistic or hedonistic, and science devolves as well. That's why all these advances were made by theists, and they have not been made by atheists. That's a fact. Look at the fundamental advances of science. There haven't been any new huge ones in the last 50 years. It's because people used to believe in God. Or they would at least assume God for the sake of argument, which means that they are theists, essentially. If they're really operating as if God exists, then you are a theist. That doesn't mean that if you sin or something, that doesn't mean you're a theist. It just means like if you orient your life or navigate life through at least the assumption of theism at its core, then you're a theist. So if you're navigating scientific questions with that as an assumption, you're a theist. But that doesn't happen anymore. In fact, it's the opposite that is assumed. It's not even that it's... Let's assume you could be agnostic about God for a minute. That's not even how science is done. It's done under the assumption of anti-theism, which, if anti-theism is wrong, it means that the context by which you are assuming, the frame that you assume as the context of sense-making, scientific sense-making, is fundamentally wrong if theism is true and you're assuming anti-theism. And that would lead to no advances in 50 years. So Brian Keating did a video for PragerU when I was working there called God or the Multiverse, and you can check it out on their channel. It was very good. I helped film it and produce it and market it, and it's about like how basically you can't avoid assumptions at the foundation, and that this idea that that theists just simply believe without evidence, and that people who believe in the multiverse or in extraterrestrial life, they are science people, but people who believe in God are not science people, and that's just due to dogma. And you can't really fault the religious institutions so much for that entirely. It's partially that, but them and their lack of willingness to be like, okay, you know what? It appears like, I don't know, that that we have to examine this scientific observation and try and contextualize it within theism. There were some instances in which they didn't do that, and I can't name specific ones, but honestly, I would assume that they were, the reason why they were not willing to go forward with that, and they kind of divorced themselves from the sciences for so long, was because of actually the dogma of some people in science and some ideas that were coming out in science being fundamentally wrong. And the reason why I would say that is because if you're going to say like, oh, evolution, they just didn't believe in evolution, so they couldn't go along with science. Guys, there were scientists who grew plants and observed animals and raised livestock, and they bred them for specific traits and characteristics for thousands and thousands of years. How could you say they didn't believe in, genetic inheritance? That doesn't, if natural selection is contextualized as absent of also intelligent design and different from intelligent design, which I would say it's not. I don't like either term, to be honest. There is no design without intelligence. There's no unintelligent design, and there is no, if theism is correct, then there is no natural selection that is absent of any kind of intelligent design. It's just, they're just both just not good terms. But people known about genetic inheritance for thousands of years, and they were monks who were, testing the inheritance of, the color of peas and the shape of peas. You learn about this stuff in school, and they were like devoutly theistic monks, devout theists, and they were testing genetic inheritance. Don't tell me they didn't believe in genetic inheritance or even adaptation. It's just, and people who say things like, well, adaptation isn't evolution. Macroevolution has no... macroevolution, we don't even know what that means yet. And there is no microevolution versus macroevolution. But there is something missing in evolution, which is, where did life come from? And why does it appear to have more order to it than it would if it was just all based on random mutations? Because it can't be based on random mutations, because randomness doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean mutations don't exist. It's just, I really do believe it was the fault of the scientific community, not of, more so than it was the fault of the theistical institutions. They've never not been associated with science until the last, 100 years, 50 years. That was brand new. And it was also the era of kind of the beginning of a lack of advancement in science. And in foundational understanding, scientific understanding, at least, not in like, we made more computers and stuff like that. But I would say that there is, I've said this before kind of as well, as that if you look here in this clip, scientists will say things like this all the time.
There are just certain elements that they can't get themselves to subscribe to.
Yeah, right. They want to believe that everything they do is rational, but I don't think a person who did everything rationally would appear very rational. In other words, I think we all have irrational beliefs, and then some are more irrational maybe than others, and it's kind of it almost provides an outlet for people. Like, we're going to combine things. I was interviewed recently, and someone asked me, like, what do you want to discover with the Simons Observatory? Or what do you believe? Did inflation occur, or was there a bounce? And we're going to get into those subjects in just a bit with you, because they feature prominently in existential physics. But I said, I don't want to believe in anything. Like, I want to have evidence for something. Like I said, I always joke, I don't believe in gravity. I don't have faith in gravity. We have evidence for gravity. And one of the consistent themes in your wonderful new book is the power of a scientific idea is that from which you can make calculations and you can make observations comport within the context of that particular framework.
Okay, so this idea of like not wanting to believe in something but wanting evidence for something. There are certain things when you're talking about fundamental reality, which is where everybody wants to go. Everybody wants a theory of everything. Now everybody's talking about God and consciousness constantly. And quantum mechanics, which is fundamental interactions, essentially, much more so than even people think of when they think of just like elementary particles. I think that there's you and your beingness follows quantum mechanics. Like, you are the quantum, and you just don't see it because you are it. But this idea, though, that you want evidence for something and you don't want to believe it, this gets tricky when you start looking at ideas that are foundational, because it will appear like there is a lack of evidence, but it's actually that there is never a lack of evidence, and so therefore you cannot ever see an instance in which there isn't evidence, and therefore to have it to contrast against an instance in which there is evidence. So this is the idea of, like, does a fish know what water is? I don't know. It's never not in water. It's constantly in water. And if you tell a fish to point to water, it's going to be like, what are you talking about? What the heck is water? That sounds... You're telling me there's this, like, flowing thing that is around me all the time, and they'd be like, that's just space. What are you talking about? But they'd be like, that's space-time. But that's because it's always there. It's for a fish. You'd have to take a fish out of water and then put him back in the water, and then he'd have like an existential crisis probably. But we don't have that with consciousness or God, either your consciousness or God's consciousness, both of them, regardless of, even if you don't even have to believe in God in order to realize that you cannot escape consciousness. You are always looking at your world through the lens of consciousness, and it is always the foundational aspect of your observation that is, framing of whatever it is that you are observing, because it is observation. Consciousness is inseparable from observation, or yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. And that is the problem here. You cannot also, if God is real, then that's also true of God. You cannot escape God, even if he's real. So you can't. He is an unfalsifiable idea. God. So is consciousness. That does not make it bad science. It doesn't make it something that you just can't falsify it, so therefore you can't prove it, so therefore it's not worth, even assuming, let's if you don't assume it, then you assume its non-existence. I don't, dissume, is that even a word? I don't know. But that is the only option if you don't assume it. And that will drive you crazy, because it does make you crazy. You're denying reality if you are assuming consciousness doesn't exist. Who's assuming consciousness doesn't exist? You. Who are you? You not conscious? It's you prove the foundational nature of consciousness in even thinking about anything. And if God is real, if God exists, this is also true of God. He's an inescapable construct. Okay? Just like consciousness. It's just consciousness, your consciousness, is an intrinsic constraint that you cannot escape. Like the present moment. You're always in the present moment. You're always in your own consciousness. But there's an extrinsic constraint that would be God's consciousness, that is a different constraint. It's a mirrored constraint. It's similar, but it's just you're within it instead of it being within you, kind of like your consciousness is in you, but you are within God's consciousness. So but consciousness is mind, and mind is a construct. It's a structure, and so it's inescapable. No matter what, it's inescapable. So this idea that you could, if you try and assume that you can escape it, you can't. And I have talked about this before in streams that Sabine has done, where she thinks you can divorce consciousness from an observation because you can use just a mechanism to make a measurement. It just makes no sense. But if my point is, though, is that if something is unfalsifiable, that doesn't always mean that it is just something that is too far away or too detached for you to ever be able to prove. It can also mean that it is so attached that you cannot detach, and therefore it is intrinsically existent. It's beyond proven. It's proven, but it's more than proven. It's like you can't even, it's intrinsically existent. It's not even proven. It's like beyond proven. It's more obvious than proof. Okay? Consciousness is beyond proven. It's beyond provability. But not because it's it's not unfalsifiable and because it's so distant and we just don't know, it's so abstract and weird, and it's because you can't escape it. It is there every time you look. And if that is true of something, then it should be a foundational inclusion in your framing of your reality. And this is my issue with people who, one of them is Sabine, who get this very wrong. And I'm not talking about even her ideas on God, even though I do disagree with I disagree with the idea that you can even be agnostic. So like, I can't say I disagree with her on God, but I disagree with her on even whether or not you can be agnostic about God. But I disagree with her very much so about whether or not you can divorce consciousness from anything in physics. You can't. And the assumption that you can't is insane. It's legitimately insane. I don't say that to be like demeaning. It's just, if there is a definition of insane, that would be like an instance in which, you're adhering to the definition. It's just, it's nonsensical. So, not just because something is not falsifiable doesn't mean you should just write it off. Sometimes it means you can't write it off and you have to include it. Okay, this is fascinating.
Book is the power of a scientific idea is that from which you can make calculations and you can make observations comport within the context of that particular framework. But I'm wondering, to push back with respect, as I always do, there are situations where people explain data using models that are completely wrong. I'll point out Kepler, right? Kepler used, Tycho's data and other observations, and he made it beautifully fit into this model of the solar system that had. I gotta put these in here, Sabine, because I bought these just for our interview. So he had these crystalline, spheres, and he had orbs, and he had pyramids and all sorts of cool things, and he got the right answers. So how do you react to that? How do you react to the fact that sometimes a totally wrong idea can still be consistent with data? Are we in danger of being too beholden to the notion that everything has to be falsifiable and et cetera, and Popperian? Are we too in love with these ideas lately in terms of our scientific?
Well, you say it's a totally wrong idea, but the only reason we know this is that we got better data and it didn't fit to it, right? I mean, and this is exactly how science is supposed to work.
Okay.
Being too beholden.
Fascinating. Okay. First of all, they're both wrong, and I push back with respect to both of them. I have little things like this sitting on my desk, and I use them to explain, like, what is a tetrahedron? What is a tetrahedron within a tetrahedron? You are a tetrahedron within a tetrahedron. And what is, these weird shapes that look a lot like that thing that you see that's on right here. Okay? And I don't know the details of Kepler's model, but I will say this. If Kepler's model allowed for him to make accurate predictions, then you cannot actually say that it was wrong. And the reason why Brian says it's wrong is because of what Sabine said, which is that the assumption that we got better data, we got more data, we saw we put a probe out into Pluto and like it came back and it didn't look like this. And that doesn't matter. If a model allows for you to make accurate predictions, then the model is accurate. It's not completely wrong, as Brian, calls this model. It means that it's accurate. But that doesn't mean that it's accurate in every context. And the issue here is that when you divorce consciousness from foundational reality, then you divorce perspective from physics. And if you do that, then you assume that just because you put a probe to Pluto and you didn't see this, that this is wrong. And it's not necessarily wrong. There's something about that model, if that was used to make accurate predictions, that I assume would be correct in its prediction about the substructure of our solar system that is not necessarily physically perceivable, but mathematically has, is accurate, geometrically is accurate in some way. Their models can be different for the same kind of the same thing, but they are different when their difference is dependent upon their goal. And this is why I said earlier, is like goal frame our scientific pursuits. And if that thing can make scientific predictions or mathematical predictions accurately in certain context, that doesn't mean it can do it in all contexts, in the context of all goals. Okay, it's goal dependent. And that looks fascinating. And it also looks beautiful. And it also, apparently, according to Brian, made accurate predictions. If that's the case, who are we to say it's wrong? That's like saying, it's like arguing with results. You can't argue with results. You can try, but like eventually the results are going to win. And I face this with my theory of sentient singularity theory quite a bit, is when I start showing certain models and I start talking about certain numbers popping up, certain quantities popping up in certain instances, and how I used symmetry to, of those quantities to build up, because I was just kind of like, well, if it's like that here, then maybe it's also like that, here, and then we'll see what happens. And then if it lines up, if that is the case, when I did that, and I came up with a term that was like extra arithmetic symmetry. It's like when you see that the structure of a model is mirroring the a quantity that is calculated within it, and that quantity's numbers that make it up, let's say it's 33, also have a like an aspect to them where it's 33 is, in our way of writing it, is 3 by 3. It's a 3 by 3. So then it's calculated in a 3 by 3 grid. Why is that? I don't know. I called it an extra arithmetic symmetry. And people say things like, well, that's just a coincidence, and it's you're, maybe you calculated something correctly, maybe that is actually a useful model, but that doesn't make it correct. No, you can't do that. That doesn't work. If something is able to make predictions consistently within a specific context, it's accurate. If it's within the confines of that goal, able to do those things. So I think that even the terminology that they're using to describe this stuff, where Brian says it's the model's totally wrong because that's not what the solar system looks like, or where Sabine's like, well, we got more data and that disproved that. No, maybe that data came from a different goal than that, and that isn't, that model, that geometric model, is not meant to just be physically perceivable structure where you're meant to see the lines of the triangle or pyramid or anything like that. Why would that be the case? If that's the case, then how come every manifold structure that's described and predicted in string theory, how come that isn't nonsense? Like, that's still like, manifold structure that you can't point to. But I think that those manifold structures would be able to make predictions in the right context. Unfortunately, they're not being applied in the right context, and they're not making any predictions, but still. You can't, so, like, you cannot divorce goals from our models of reality, and that means you can't divorce them from sentience, and you take that to its inevitable conclusion. This idea that science, they said later on after this clip that science and belief don't mix. And as Brian said, he's like, I don't want to believe, I want to, measure, essentially. And I want evidence. It's like, you have to begin your investigation on an assumption, but not all assumptions are blind beliefs. I would say that blind belief is actually probably impossible, and if you can do it, it's very stupid. But there are certain beliefs, like, consciousness being a required component of our physical observations. You can't escape that. You have to assume that. Okay. Let's answer some questions, then I'll go on to the next. We'll finish by 10. Excited for another episode. Sorry I'm late. Hello from South Carolina. Hello. This is the physics class I wish I had. Awesome. I love that you're able to articulate what I have found to be true so much better than me, specifically the thing about consciousness being self-evident. That is one thing I have also realized is, like, I am not the only person to have these ideas, but I am specifically, I won't say uniquely, because I don't know about uniquely, but like very specifically able to articulate them. And that has to do with the way in which I constructed sentient singularity theory, which you can look at sentientsingularity.com, and just the models that I had created that were linguistic models, and then they allowed me to build the framework to discuss these things. Without those foundational things, like what I call the 4 primary perspectives of inside, outside, separate, and oneness, you can't discuss these things very well. It's very hard, but it's very easy to see when people get it. If, when 2 people get it, they can see that, each other gets it, but that doesn't mean that you can articulate it. And I'm trying to do that. So I'm glad that it's resonating with you. So I appreciate the comment. So next. They do talk about Max Tegmark, and he has this mathematical universe theory. I hate that term, mathematical universe. First of all, I think it's wrong. I think mathematics is not fundamental. And the assumption that it is wrong.
So, don't get me wrong.
And also, I think that it comes off as an attempt to be like, to say something that is so non-specific but also so inclusive that you can't not be correct. It's like, my theory is that the universe is mathematical. Okay. Who disagrees with that? Probably me. Like, fundamentally, but emergently, no, I don't disagree with that. But I would say I'm probably the only person that I can think of that is like, would say that they disagree with that fundamental assumption. But most people think that the universe, then math is fundamental. So to say, I believe, in a mathematical universe, it's just kind of, it's like cheating, but I still think it doesn't get you where you need to be fundamentally accurate. But I will, and I'm aware that there's much more detail to his mathematical universe assumption. And one of them is apparently that there's 4 levels to his theory. I didn't know that. We're going to talk more about this another time when we do a stream on his mathematical universe specifically. But level 1, beyond the cosmic universe. There are things that are invisible, but we can, test them. The multiverse, post-inflation bubbles, quantum many worlds, and other mathematical structures. I will say at least he got the number right of like how to segment the universe. The dimensions of the universe is 4. It's 4-dimensional. That's true. But pretty much every theory puts forth that. Clearwin's emergence theory puts forth that. Geometric unity puts forth that. Sentient singularity theory puts forth that. Carl Friston's free energy principle puts forth that. Constructor theory puts forth that. Max Tegmark's mathematical universe puts forth that. Our current, theory of relativity puts forth that about space-time. Fundamental physics has 4 fundamental forces. So that puts forth that. I mean, that's just true everywhere. But the question is like, why is that the case? Why is everything 4-dimensional fundamentally? And that's not really answered by any theories, any of these theories that I know of. Maybe Carl Friston's free energy principle. That's pretty, and sentient singularity theory, obviously. But that's pretty much it. I don't even think constructor theory or Clearwin's emergence theory do it. Which Clearwin's emergence theory puts forth that everything is, based on little tetrahedrons, but it's like, what does that mean? There's like a reason for that. A theory of everything is, as I've stated before, if you look at sentient singularity theory on sentientsingularity.com, a theory of everything is a recognizable, describable, you could say predictable and applicable pattern that occurs in all instances of objective observation and an explanation for such pattern. And this is usually left out. Because this always ends up being God. You either have this and it's God, or you don't have this. So, next clip. The issue with being critical, and I will say, I do have noticed I am a bit more critical when I hear...
falsifiability means it is science, but I can prove to you that my astrologer, yes, I go to...
when I hear Sabine or Sabina in a stream, I do tend to just be more critical, and I don't think that that's intentional. I think that it's because of the nature of her statements. And I still think that, she's a very valuable thinker. But I will say that there is, like I've said, this cognitive dissonance, and it's not unique to just her. It's just very common among more academically associated physicists, but not all of them, but a lot of them. Brian's very good about, entertaining the idea of God, at least. I'm not going to, assume his personal assumptions, but if you watch his video, God or the Multiverse, he does accurately call out, though, that, many people believe in the multiverse, and it is not provable. Many people believe in life, in extraterrestrial life. In fact, there's no evidence, I think, of extraterrestrial life. I still think that those UFOs and UAPs are real and stuff, but I've talked about it before. I don't think that they're from another planet. I did see one, by the way, another one, my second UFO, this past weekend. I'll talk about it on another stream. I didn't get a chance to film this one. I did film the first one. It's on here if you want to see it. That was an incredible video. I will go edit the description of that video to include a link to another video that somebody took of the same craft the same day that I saw. But this one, we went to ice cream, and my wife and I was with my wife the first time that I saw the other one too, and we came out of the ice cream place. This was 2 days ago, so Sunday night, and it's probably like 8:30, and we're walking to the car, and I saw it looked like Venus in the sky. It looked like a planet. It was like very bright light, and I think right now Venus is visible at night when you're looking northeast. I think it's Venus. It might be Jupiter, but I gotta double check. But there is one planet at least, and I'm pretty sure it's Venus, that is visible. We can actually check because I am curious. I have this app called Skyview, and I use it to check planets. And we can see it looks like it's actually Jupiter. Where is Venus? I don't even see Venus around. Mercury. I don't know. I see Jupiter where close to where I'm expecting a big planet to be, so it's probably Jupiter. But I saw a planet, it looked like a planet, in the place that was not where this other planet is that I see every night when I take my dogs out. It was in the opposite direction. And I was like, wow, I've never seen a planet in that direction lately. Let's pull out Skyview. And there was a helicopter that was investigating. It looked like it was investigating it. It was very close. If this thing wasn't a planet, it was, and it was here in our atmosphere, then it looked like this helicopter was kind of circling it. And I went and I pulled out Skyview, and I was like, I think that's a planet though, because it wasn't as bright as the first one that I saw, which means it was probably further away. And it was further away, if it was even there. And then I pointed, the Skyview app at it, and it was not a planet. There was nothing there. And then I looked at my wife, and I was like, it's not a planet. And then it just disappeared, right in front of us. It's the brightest light in the sky just disappears. There was a helicopter flying around it, and this helicopter was not as bright as this, floating light. And when it disappeared, the helicopter flew to where it was, and it looked like the pilot was like, what the heck just happened? It's gone. And that was it. It was gone. It was only for a few seconds. Like I said, it was just hovering there and just disappeared. And this helicopter was it looked like a police helicopter, was just appeared to be what the heck just happened? And that was interesting. But I don't think that that's evidence of extraterrestrial life from outer space. There is no evidence that it's from outer space that I know of, even if these beings are real, and their technological craft. Just even if you assume that doesn't mean they're from another planet. And but there is no evidence that we know of technological life out in space that we have identified. Even if we have identified advanced technology here that maybe is from, people from the future or something. I don't know. But like, that doesn't, so, but I'd say there is constant evidence for God. There's no evidence for extraterrestrial life from other planets. There's actually an absence, like an actual absence of, there's not even an absence. There is evidence against the idea that there is life on other planets. That doesn't mean there isn't. I'm just saying that from our current understanding, we could be being hidden. It could be being hidden from us, like Eric Weinstein talks about with like Sentinel Island, where basically just like people are keeping us hidden from, the Galactic Federation is hidden from us. I tend to not believe that, but I admit that it's possible. Like, I don't want to discount the idea. But from what we can observe, there's an absence of any evidence to support that. In fact, there's evidence that from what we observe that is against that idea. There is constant evidence for the existence of God. It just might not be the evidence you want, but there is evidence. That doesn't, it's like logical. It seems to me to be logically inevitable too. You don't have to take my word for that. We'll talk about that another time. But that doesn't seem to be true of life on other planets, even though it does mathematically. I get that. People are like, the odds are, But that assumes that we understand life. Why is there only one apparent genesis of life on Earth? If Earth is so perfect for life, and life is just filled, everywhere in the universe where it's, a habitable zone, how come life didn't spawn twice that we can perceive on Earth? Because we don't understand, like, what life even is. And Sarah Walker talks about this, and she's right. It's more like of a cumulative process, I think, than we think of it as. It's not just like wherever you get, someplace warm and wet, there's life. Life is a kind of a stupid word. It's a bad word. What is life? If sentient singularity theory is correct, and the universe itself and existence itself and atoms themselves are all sentient, where's life didn't have a beginning? Like, life exists. Everything, if sentience is equivalent to, is the same thing as life, then it always existed. But regardless, like, I think people need to rethink their just like what certain ideas imply about the evidence that would be apparent. Like, if you want evidence for God, what evidence do you want? If you want evidence of life on other planets, what evidence is there? It's not even just that there's no apparent life, technological life that we can perceive on other planets, at least right now that I'm aware of. It's also the lack of, multiple, Genesis events on Earth that is odd and should suggest something about like our lack of understanding of of life, within the current scientific narrative of its definition. But there are certain ideas, though, that I think are kind of mathematically inevitable and consistent with some evidence, and not as much evidence as like God.
People say all falsifiability means it is science, but I can prove to you that my
but also but are seem to be more mathematically inevitable than like life on other planets, if you actually assume that the evidence that we see regarding life from other planets is accurate. Then you have to contextualize that. You can't just be like, there's so many planets. It's like, but why did life only evolve once on Earth at one time? It's just odd. It just implies a lack of understanding. It doesn't mean that there's no life on other planets. It just means like, well, our current understanding is wrong. But this idea that they're going to talk about now, the simulation hypothesis, is another one of these ideas of similar to life on other planets, or even you could say God, where it's like it seems inevitable almost, but some of these are more inevitable than others.
Wonderful narrator, Gina, I think her name is. Anyway, she's wonderful. The English version, at least. I hope you do the German version. Sabine, what I love to do recently, since you've been on the show 4 times, but I've only recently started to make this a patented trademark segment of the show. I always begin by asking the authors who come on the show the meaning, the interpretation of the title of the book, of the cover design of the book, and especially of the subtitle of the book as well. So I'm wondering, can you do what we're never supposed to do and judge this book by its cover?
Well, so I have to admit that the title wasn't my doing. My suggestion for the title was More Than This, like the song. And it was supposed to say physics is so much more than what we learn in school, balls rolling down inclined planes and resistors and all that kind of stuff. And this title, Existential Physics, is what my editor came up with. He wanted to get the word physics in the title. And I thought he has a point, that people know what it is about. So I gave ground on this, but I insisted on my idea for the illustration, which was a butterfly fading away into some kind of particles. So I wanted to say everything is made of particles. Like, this is what people always accuse physicists of, right? You want to reduce everything to the particles, and that's bad, bad, bad. And so I was trying to say, it's right, everything is made of particles, but that's not the end of the story. There's so much more to it, because there's all this complexity and chaos also coming out of it. And this is why the butterfly, it's supposed to allude to the butterfly effect.
And of course, your first book was called Lost in Math. And I kind of was thinking about this book, and maybe another title, if you publish with me someday, would be Found in Physics. Because I think, your first book kind of decried the situation of how, physics is being almost overarchingly taken over by this love of beauty and symmetry and organization, and thanks to math. And then this is kind of, things are blowing apart, the butterfly separating the chaotic nature, which is closer to reality, of course. And so, yes, and the subtitle is A Scientist's Guide to Life's Biggest Questions. And the commonality between these two books, your two books, is that you're kind of a heroine in your own story.
Why is chaos more similar, linked to reality than symmetry and beauty? I would say they both are, but they have to do with context. Chaos comes from a specific context, and symmetry and beauty are, I would say, actually more fundamental to reality than chaos. Chaos is kind of emergent, and symmetry and beauty is also, you could say it's also emergent, but it's the default, whereas chaos is kind of contextual, and it has to do with the fact that you're dealing with two different sentient beings in a hierarchy, and one of them wants one thing and another one wants another, and then chaos emerges. But if you're in alignment, perfect alignment of what you want, and you know what each other needs, and then that's, you're going to avoid chaos. But this idea that they're going to talk about right now is the simulation hypothesis. And it's another one of those ones, like I said, of it's logic seems to imply it. Just like life, extraterrestrial life, to some degree. I think no, actually, observation seems to not imply it. But even if logic, you could say mathematically inevitable, but that's not how math works. Right? Math is deterministic and not just probabilistic. And so the idea that it's just because there's so many planets that there's going to be life on other planets, that does not mean that it's inevitable.
Predictions. Well, no one's found any of this evidence. Like they've actually looked for it. Like these particular patterns. I think Will Kinney wrote a paper about this idea with the dark flow, and then the thing with the bubble collisions. I mean, you know that they haven't actually found the signature, right?
Right. And I think, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, people say, oh, falsifiability means it is science, but I can prove to you that my astrologer, yes, I go to see an astrologer, she made a prediction. It didn't come true. Therefore, it must be science, right? So, but one person you do call out by name is upcoming guest Nick Ballstrom, who you say the simulation hypothesis, and I'm quoting, annoys me. Why does it annoy you? How can a scientific idea or philosophical idea annoy you?
Well, if they would just use it as a philosophical idea, that'd be fine with me. But it has this, they're trying to give it this scientific flavor, right? And what it actually is, the simulation hypothesis, it's a statement about the properties of the fundamental laws of nature. And that's something which physicists deal with. It's not philosophy. And so if you believe that you can actually encode general relativity and the standard model of particle physics on a particular type of computer, then you better tell me how you're going to do this. And it's not a trivial problem. I mentioned some examples, like especially when you're talking about chaotic systems and that kind of stuff. It's not as simple as just saying, well, if no one's looking into this corner of the world, I don't have to compute it. That's cheating, right? Please show me your algorithm, and then show that it actually reproduces our observations. And of course, they don't do this. Like they don't even get anywhere close. And this is why I say it annoys me. Now, if you want to talk about it on this philosophical level, like we may all be simulation for brains and that or whatever. I'm like, yeah, do what you want.
Okay, this is kind of my issue with. If I have an issue with Sabine or Sabina, is this, and it's not just an issue with her. It is this. It's with a bunch of physicists these days who want to try and separate philosophy from physics, but can't, and don't even themselves do so. But when somebody else does this, where they go and they try and philosophize about the fundamental nature of our reality, it's annoying. And that makes no sense. Why are you asking, in your book, Existential Physics, the very first question you're asking physicists is, are you religious? Or do you believe in God? Does God, at play in your life? Why are you asking these questions? If they're like philosophical questions. Sean Carroll, who is a great teacher, but I have issues with the way in which he deals with criticism of his ideas, or of his ideas about academia. Very serious issues with it, which is what I was thinking about talking about later, not with Sean Carroll specifically, but with others, spurred by other events. But just kind of a general problem is just this evasiveness that is common amongst people who are in this academic world. But we'll talk about that later. But Sean Carroll, though, he did say once, that very rightfully so, and it was kind of inspiring to me, actually. And it was inspiring, actually, to me. When I first started this project, it wasn't even this project. It was just like I had an idea for an experiment in physics, and that was it. I didn't have a theory. I thought geometric unity was probably correct, or that Clearwin's emergence theory is probably correct. I didn't have like a care of whose theory it was. I didn't have my own, but I had an experiment and I wanted it done, and I still do, and I am working on that. We will talk about it later this year. We'll have an entire episode dedicated to it. But that but I knew I didn't have I was facing an uphill battle. Like, not having a PhD in physics, I was facing an enormous uphill battle. I haven't even taken physics in high school. And I saw Sean Carroll on Joe Rogan, and he was like, philosophers there's a lot of potential for philosophers to do a lot in physics, because just the nature of philosophy meshes well with physics, and you didn't have to be a physicist to make progress in physics. You could be a philosopher. And I was like, right on. And I also used his Big Ideas in the Universe lecture series earlier on to and other lectures that he did to just learn about physics and also learn about what academia thought about God. And I did a video called God is a Good Theory. It's one of the first videos on here where I make a critique of his argument that he puts forth in a lecture called God is Not a Good Theory. And he blocked me for that video. But that's what I mean by evasiveness. That's not a good quality in scientists. I'd rather you be kind of rude but willing to, engage in the fight than just be evasive, like as a scientist. The problem with it is that you can't be in science and not be in the fight. So when you're evasive of a fight, and I mean like an intellectual fight, a battle of ideas, then what happens is it's basically like you like run in, sucker punch somebody, and run out of the ring. And that, because you can't not be in the ring. So anytime you put forth something and you're like, God is not a good theory because this and this and this, and somebody comes along and is like, actually, wrong. And you're just like, instinct is like blocked. That it's one thing if you're harassing somebody, then harassment is horrible, and you should block people who harass you. But if somebody makes one 30-second video or says one comment where they're like, hey, this is why I think you're wrong, and you block them because of it, you need to work on that as a scientist. I'm just going to say that. I'm not going to be super mean, but you are not going about this in an honest and productive manner. Like, if you lose, then you lose, and you should get credit for being in the fight, and even when you know that you're losing, because there is a point in every debate or every physical fight, even, which is irrelevant to this, but still, where you just realize that you kind of you've lost. But if you're willing to stay in it, that is admirable. Because it's an admission of your loss, which is actually a win in a battle of ideas. It's not the same as a physical fight. It's, if you can admit in a debate that you've lost, you have won. And science is like that too. And science is like a societal debate. And if you're just going to run in, sucker punch, and leave, and I don't know, you want every video that you've done with someone who beat you in some ideas or just pissed you off or something deleted, or you block everyone who can show the error in your argument, then you are doing a disservice to science. Especially, and it's amplified by your institutional acceptance, because you're blocking the ideas that would win because they are truer, at least, from being widely seen, because you're blocking them. And I disagree with that as a demeanor or a tactic. It's not a good tactic for a scientist. But But the point is, Sean Carroll said that philosophers have a lot of, you know, there's a lot of room for philosophers in physics, and I agree with him very much. And so the idea that you have to divorce philosophy from science, or you divorce theism from science, that doesn't mean that you take scripture and you literally interpret it and you say that because it's in scripture, it therefore is factual. No, in science, like, it's therefore scientifically understood. Like, no, you have to go and you have to test an idea. You can get it from scripture, you can get it from anywhere, but you have to, science does involve testing, I would say, and logical arguments, mathematical arguments, things like that. But philosophy is inseparable from fundamental physics. And I would argue so is theism, obviously. Sean Carroll would not. He would argue that theism is totally separable from physics. But he would prove that it isn't in his attempt to prove that it is. And you can watch my video on that to see how that is. But you have to include these philosophical frameworks in order to contextualize what we physically perceive. And I don't understand why this would be annoying to Sabine or Sabina. Even if she says, well, you can't make the prediction, you can't, it's not making any predictions. It's like, neither is string theory right now, neither is many worlds, neither is the multiverse. So many of these things are not making observable predictions. That doesn't make them not science, or not part of science. I don't know where the line is between philosophy and science. I would say, like, if philosophy is directed within a goal, then by a goal, then it's linked to science. But the problem is a lot of philosophy is not linked to a goal, and it's just nonsense, like every other field today. But that's including physics. So I realize I am jumping around, but I don't understand this attempt to detach and, like, isolate and keep physics pure. It's not. There is no purity in any of these fields. Like, you have to contextualize each of these fields, and that means you have to link them to things outside them. So philosophy is the framing that you use, or it is what you use to frame physics. It is. They talk about panspermia and and Brian rightly says panspermia is an explanation for the origin of life on Earth, but not an explanation for the origin of life. As I stated, if sentient singularity theory is correct, then there is no origin of life if life means sentient beings existing. So it's just a bad question, but do want to get into 2 more clips and then we're going to call it. I'll answer questions and that'll be it. Eventually I'm going to do a video that is not live and that is produced later this year about these topics of that I take issue with, where like consciousness being divorced from physics and philosophy is different than science, and like I'll do an organized video on it, because I do realize that it's not. There's so many instances in which this is corrupting our scientific narratives and institutions that it is very difficult to keep a linear, like, thought surrounding it, because every time you start talking about this, you have to explain that, okay, well, also that I'm saying this within the context of our current assumptions about, life, and whether or not there's life on other planets. It's like, well, we have to first talk about whether or not our conceptualization of life is even correct. So it's difficult to stay on track. But I will do a much more organized video about it. But they're going to talk about these cyclic models. If you know sentient singularity theory, you know that it's got this cycle to what I call verses, and through a periodicity of sentience or of consciousness, and it is actually very much similar to the simulation hypothesis, but it's also theism, and it is but it's not a game like it's not a simulation, it's a replication, but then you have models like conformal cyclic cosmology, which is like Roger Penrose's cyclical universe theory, which kind of looks similar to this when it's modeled, and but then people talk about bouncing, universes where like you have expansion and inflation, and then you have contraction, and then it expands again, and then contraction and expands again, and they call it like a bouncing model. And I don't know how much I agree with that specifically, but like there is a mechanism that looks like that. So they're talking about all of those kind of.
So past guest Anna Aegis, who has been on the show recently talking about cyclic models. Why do you say it's worse than inflation? Is it like what Winston Churchill said about democracy, the worst form of government, except for all the others? Is it true that bouncing models are really worse than inflation? If so,
Well, I'm not sure I said that it's worse than inflation, but it's worse than lambda CDM, like what you could call the standard Big Bang model, basically. And I would say that inflation is already tacked onto this model, right? And so the reason why I say it's worse is that you're inventing a more complicated story that comes before the beginning, basically. So you're tacking on this whole story about an earlier universe which collapsed, and then if you're with Penrose, and I mean you talk to him on your channel, then he gives you this story about supermassive black holes that radiate and that leave some kind of imprint in the cosmic microwave background in our universe. And the obvious question that you should ask, like, why don't you just start with an initial state that had this imprint? Wouldn't this be much simpler than inventing this complicated story for how they came about? And so I think that all those models are running into this problem at some point, that if you go back in time, the initial state becomes simpler and simpler and simpler. And if you want to attach a more complicated story that happened earlier, there's no scientific justification to do this.
Okay, so on the bouncing model, the criticism that you actually say is that
first you have to define scientific. Like, what is scientific? And I've talked about this before. It's kind of like a tone. And she said this Sabine says this in this stream, actually. She says, people like Nick Bostrom, which Nick Bostrom's going to be on Brian Keating's podcast pretty soon. We are going to review that, I'm sure. Brian asked questions on it, and I did send him one. And we'll see if he remembers to put it in there. But I basically asked on Twitter, and I sent it to him on Twitter, and he liked it, so he has seen it. And which is that Nick is a technological sentience an inevitably emergent being through natural processes, or is it something that humans have to try and create it for it to be created? And because they're going to be talking about technological superintelligences, or AGI, which is a terrible term. But we'll see what happens with that. I hope they touch on that question, but I'm sure that will be a fascinating stream. But this, I'm not exactly sure what her issue is with any kind of like cyclic cosmological model. I don't think that there's anything wrong with a cyclic cosmological model. I think that it is actually real, but the question is like, what explains the existence of a cyclic cosmological model in the first place, or of any cosmological model, let alone a cyclic cosmological model? You have to explain both of them, and you have to have at least a logical explanation for both of them. That doesn't mean that you have like scientific evidence for what happened in the previous aeon, but it doesn't mean that it wouldn't appear to be a logical inevitability either. You could make logical arguments, but that is part of science. Like, it's not separate from science. But that, if science is anything, like I said, what is science? She said it's kind of like a tone in this, and I think that's right. Part of the problem is when you look at people who are religious and they're talking about things like grace and I don't know, like communion, and not just communion, but like, what's a good one? What do they say use as a word for, community, essentially? It's like, I forgot, but I had it. But I know that there is a language that is used by people who are in religious communities that is totally different than people who are in a different religious community, or in, the secular community. And that's true of science too. Scientific communities or secular communities usually use a specific language, and that is different than like a Christian, community. Fellowship, that's the word, fellowship. Like when they're talking about like fellowship, the importance of fellowship, and serving, and like all these words that you just don't get it. And then you get into like other, you get into like Islam or Hasidic Judaism, and you're like, what is the Bainani? What is I don't know, like Dajjal. Like, there's so many different terms that you just don't know. But so those are actual different languages. But when you're looking at like Protestant, American or your English-speaking European circles, at least, that are Christian, they'll use words that are English, but like, you don't use those words if you're in a secular community. And if you are in those communities, you don't use these words that scientifically, scientific or secular communities use. And if science is anything, it is like, it's like a taste. It's like saying Cajun food. It's like, or Hispanic food, or like, I don't know, like barbecue. It's like, what is barbecue? It's not just things on a barbecue, like it's like a taste of food. Like, it's like, there's a flavor associated with barbecue. There's barbecue sauce. You don't put that sauce on the barbecue. Like, you put it on meat and you put it on the barbecue sometimes or something, but like, the sauce is not from the barbecue. So why is it called barbecue sauce? Because it's associated with like this flavor. And science also kind of is, while it is a method, true, it's also kind of like it's another way of saying pursuit of truth in a lot of communities. And but so is theology, and in other communities, same exact thing. Like fundamental physics, if theism is correct, then fundamental physics and theism and theology are the exact same. Like there's no difference, but in its goal. But there might be a difference in terminology and language, but that's it. And I think that definitely exists. So that's, I don't know, that's just something to be always aware of. But with these cyclical models of cosmology, where she's like, I don't know exactly what she's got an issue with, to be honest. Like, I'm a bit confused. Why is there, where she's like, why don't you make the assumption of, this state of the universe already existing, instead of making up a more complicated story, she says, giving a qualifier of complicated, about, how it arrived. You have to have an explanation. That's why I'm so confused. I don't know, to be honest. I might be totally misinterpreting her, and it's very possible. And I'm just a bit confused on what is the issue with a cyclical cosmological model, right or wrong. I don't see the problem with it. The only problem that I do see with it is when it is used as an explanation for the existence of a universe, and where people like, where'd the universe come from? Another universe. Okay, well, where did that one come from then? It's like using panspermia to explain life on Earth. Life, like, there's so many issues with that statement even, but to say, life on Earth came from another planet, so that's where life came from. It's like, well, where did that life come from? Where did the previous aeon come from, if it created this aeon? If this aeon came from the previous aeon, where did that aeon come from? Where did that aeon come from? It's like, you have to have an explanation for things at their that is for the fundamental existence as well. And I do think that a lot of these cyclical cosmological models do seem to lack that, and that just needs to be noted, but it's not a problem. Sentient singularity theory has a cyclical cosmological model, and it also has an explanation for such a pattern. But that is why I said a theory of everything is a pattern that is, perceivable, predictable, describable, applicable, and an explanation for such a pattern. And that last part is left off constantly. And the closest that we get to it outside of theology is many worlds, which is nonsense. And it's a non-explanation that is an attempt to explain. But the reason why it's the only one that exists as that is kind of an explanation for any cosmological model, whether it's cyclical or not, is that any other explanation will inevitably be God, because it has to be. Not there. That's just it. If you try and avoid God as an explanation, you get many worlds, which is nonsense. So I'm a bit confused on like what her issue is.
And the obvious question that you should ask, like, why don't you just start with an initial state that had this imprint? Wouldn't this be much simpler than inventing this complicated story for how they came about?
But what caused the imprint? That's the question. It's like, why? You have to explain how it came about. You cannot just start with like, I don't understand that. You have to explain where things come from. That's the point of, having the model of cosmogenesis. So I
think that all those models are running into this problem at some point. That if you go back in time, the initial state becomes simpler and simpler and simpler. And if you want to attach a more complicated story that happened earlier, there's no scientific justification to do this.
Yeah, like I said, you have to define scientific in that instance, but there's definitely logical arguments for a beyond the beginning, as I call it, or for the initial state, I guess you could say. But it's not, it's just for the cause. You have to, there is logical arguments for a specific cause that is beyond the beginning of these cosmological models. And I don't think that that's unscientific to think about what that would be. And I don't know. I'm just confused on what she is having an issue with. But I do understand if her issue is that they aren't explanatory of the actual like problem in and of itself, of where did multiplicity of, and where did this come from? Where did the universe come from? Sure. They don't explain where the universe came from. They explain where maybe this one came from, but not where it all came from. Where did the cosmos come from? And, but I don't think that's exactly what she's saying, but I don't know what she's saying, so it's possible. She does say later on, and to close off on a good note of agreement, she said that she thinks that just building giant, more expensive colliders is a waste of money and not the right way of to approach going forward in physics. I agree with her 100% on that. I like to end on a positive, and and I, like I said, I can disagree with anyone, and if they're willing to stay in the ring and engage like she is, then they have my utmost respect. Like, you can't get mad at people for disagreeing with you. You can be frustrated by it, but you can't be angry with them. Like, they should, as long as they're being honest, you have to be grateful for that honesty. Like, that's it. And what I do have a problem with is evasiveness and censorship and the putting of institutional acceptance above truth. Like, if you want your streams deleted for any reason whatsoever that is not to do with those streams, or if you block people because they beat your argument regarding God, or if somebody blocks you because you correctly called them out on their hypocrisy regarding public engagement with your ideas. Like, if you're like, this is just like an example, Sean Carroll criticizes Eric Weinstein for talking about his theory on podcasts. But like, all he does is talk about his theory on podcasts constantly. That doesn't mean he's not also publishing papers and stuff like that. But like, you're allowed to take issue, like Eric Weinstein did, with like the peer review academic institutional, process. I agree with his critiques. And like, you don't block somebody over that. I don't know. That is, I have, what I'm trying to say is I respect Sabine for engaging, and I very much often think that her reasoning is flawed, but I very much respect her willingness to honestly engage and continue to engage. And like, that is something to be grateful for any scientist. It is the mark of a good scientist, of a temperament that is well suited to scientific pursuits, and is disagreeability and willingness to engage in the ring, because you are always in the ring. You can't escape the ring. So to run in, do a podcast, and then want it deleted, or like run in and critique somebody on whether or not they revealed their theory on, or talk about their theory on a podcast, and then blocking them after they rebuke your criticism, or they respond to your criticism, or blocking them because you say, oh, God is not a good theory, and somebody's like, no, actually God is a good theory because this is a problem with your argument. And you're like blocked. These actions, and we'll say, I don't want to say people, because people are flawed and we all behave at times in manner that is not impeccable, but these actions are counterproductive in the seeking of truth. They absolutely are. So, props to Sabine and anyone who is not engaging continuously needs to check themselves, I think. Do you know anything about the 10 Sephirot? I know a lot about the 10 Sephirot. 10 Sephirot is the foundation of the Godhead. It is a neural network of the properties of mind. If you look at it, it's just the metaphysics of Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. But I think it's totally accurate. That doesn't mean I understand it perfectly, but like I see it enough I know that we have certain similarities in our theoretical models that appear to be the same. Triality is and gender and will at the top of the 10 Sephirot. It's like the highest of the Sephirot. If you know what the 10 Sephirot are, this is them. It's ancient science. That's what it is. It is ancient science. It's metaphysics, which is quantum physics. It's the same exact thing. It's just using terminology that is different. People say like, oh, this is just mysticism. What is mysticism? What is science? I don't know. Keter means will. These are masculine attributes and these are feminine attributes. Judgmentalness or severity, kind of understanding, which is like empathy, is feminine. Wisdom is masculine. Loving kindness, which is like grace, is masculine trait. And you have triality, and you have also like marriage, and you have will at the fundamental motivator of it all. Materialism down here. I mean, it's just a map of mind. Cognitive level, emotional level, action level. But it looks so much like the neural network models that are made by like Google AI. Like it's that doesn't mean that they're making sentient, AI right now, because I don't think they are. But I mean, the structures are similar because this is it's a hierarchical neural network of decision. It is the hierarchical neural network of decision. That's what the 10 Sephirot are. What is the fundamental nature of reality? Language-based? Yes, and no, it's sentience-based. But then within the interactions of sentience, the fundamental, you could say the emergent nature of reality is that of language-based. But because it's communicative. But like you can't say it's language-based because then you ask, well, who's speaking the language? Like, who is responsible for the communication? Sentient beings. So sentience is foundational nature of reality, not language. But language is very close. It's like the next level. Demons exist. They exist. But what they are, I think that at least, I don't know exactly, but I think that at least uh, they are basically like beings that exist on a frequency that is not normally detectable to us, but sometimes can be. You can watch my video that I say it's like I saw a Wendigo or a Skinwalker or something. It's one of the first videos on my channel, and I talk about an experience I had with what I think is essentially a demon. But it's like the only time you see those is when like your frequency gets like turned a little bit, kind of like when you're going through a certain area, and for some reason you're like picking up the Mexican station, music station, and the classical music station at the same time, but you're just trying to listen to the classical music station, but for some reason you're also picking up the Mexican station. That's when you'll see like a demon or something like that. But I don't know any other details of like the origin of them or anything like that. I haven't thought enough about it, but I do think that they exist and they're not normally perceivable, but they are around. And same thing with like angels. And I'd say the difference between an angel and a demon is like a demon would think that they work against God. And that doesn't mean they do, because eventually all will be reconciled, even if it's like through like God's direct redirection. But an angel would be like a being that works for God consciously. But yeah, I think I don't know for sure, but I do think that angels and demons exist. They just are on a frequency that we're not normally tuned to. Is it live? Yeah, it's live. She said simpler and simpler. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with simpler and simpler. That's my issue. It's like you get to a singularity. How simple can you get? It gets to simple and simple. It gets to this quadratic manifold of mind that is a singular being, and that is it. Like that is as simple as it gets. And so I don't know why like there's a problem with like a model of cosmology that gets simpler and simpler. Like it would. I talked to somebody about this. My model of cosmogenesis is this model right here recently, and I was talking about the math involved in this, and these are all equations, and like this is basically creation, the math of creation, and then you have a creation of an aeon or a verse or a observable universe, and then from there you get another one and another one and another one. It just goes on forever. But this is the math of the creation of a universe essentially, and let's see, if I change that then it all turns to zeros, but if I input 1 then all these calculates. But the math of this is basically, it's so simple, it's like 1 divided by 3, and 1/3 of your being goes into creation, because it needs to fit, creation needs to fit inside the creator, and you have to go by integers essentially, and starting with 1, because you are 1 and you have to start with that. Like there is no multiplicity yet to even exist, so you can't be like, oh, it has to divide by 1.6. That doesn't work. There is no 1.6 yet. There's just 1, and then okay, you try it again, there's 2, and then you try again, there's 3, and then basically that allows you to have 1/3, creation be 1/3, and then creator be 2/3, which is left over from like this division, and 1/3 fits within 2/3, and there you go, you get stability, and then that from there that happens. And somebody was like, that's just so simple, and of course it is. You go to the very beginning of like creation, and there isn't even the multiplicity there that is able to generate the complexity that you would for some reason assume is there. We have this assumption that like as you get closer to the beginning of the universe, the math would actually get so complicated. And I think that if you're doing it properly and you want to actually understand what happened, and that's your goal, because remember, like, the goal matters. You're not just calculating randomly for the sake of it. And you don't really have a goal. You're just kind of like, bouncing around. Then the math would be the simplest math that could possibly be at the beginning. It's not going to be complicated. It can't. There isn't multiplicity there yet, so there can't be complexity. And this is just a wrong... This assumption that it's so complicated comes from the fact that we don't understand it yet in current scientific narrative. That doesn't... First of all, they did understand it in theology thousands of years ago. Second of all, just because we don't understand something in science, quote unquote, doesn't mean it is because it is so complicated. It might be because it's so simple. Once I said to these physicists who I was talking to very early on in this, and I was like, do any of you understand geometric unity? Like, what it implies, at least? Like, if, and because I don't understand the math, like equations, but I definitely can see what it is describing and agree with most of what it is describing. And they were like, yeah, that's what we're trying to figure out. And I was like, well, newsflash, this is what it is. It's a mind. And I think that because of this is my work and it's lining up with the quantities and the structures and the implications of geometric unity. And they were like, well, the fact that you think the fact that you have the audacity, essentially, like, I think they might have even said that, but if they didn't, that's what they were saying. The audacity to think that you can understand Eric Weinstein's extremely complicated theory. And I'm like, you're claiming to not understand it. You're assuming it's complicated. Like, how do you even know it's complicated? It might be really simple, and you just don't understand it because it's like too simple, not because it's too complicated. And although I will say, like, the manner in which Eric describes his theory, very complicated. But I have my own ideas about why that would be. But I don't think that's actually natural. But I do think that, like, it's just funny that people think that every fundamental theory is so complicated. No, it's going to be simple. Like, it has to be. By default, it has to be. It has to be the math of a theory of everything's, like, most fundamental equations. It's going to be simpler than E equals MC squared. Like, it has to be. Like, complexity emerges, and as multiplicity, grows. So you go to where there's no multiplicity beyond the beginning, and there's going to be, like, the simplest equations. What demon exists? Isn't that schizophrenia? I don't know. But I don't normally see things around me, and I am perfectly capable of functioning. I'm a married man who's, works and has career and, like, has had jobs and been successful. And so I don't know what you're calling schizophrenia. I do think that schizophrenia is what people, like, what we call schizophrenia is probably people who are seeing something real, and that we then tell them that they're crazy, and it causes them to actually go crazy because they are receiving inputs that are not meshing with what the rest of their social environment is telling them is accurate. It might be more productive to be like, yeah, dude, you can hear, like, things going on other frequencies that most people can't. And, like, you just have to know that. And, like, that, try and do your best to go through life. They might be way less likely to end up as, homeless drug addicts on the street who, talk to themselves. There's nothing wrong with talking to yourself. People do it all. Everybody does it. But But schizophrenia, I think, it does not make sense that you would receive inputs from nowhere. It makes no mathematical sense. Okay? So the idea that schizophrenics are hearing and seeing things that are not at all existing is probably wrong. They probably are more sensitive than most people. And I think that even people who are not constantly so sensitive are sometimes also able to pick up on these frequencies in certain situations. Maybe some people are not sensitive at all and they have to take DMT in order to see beings or whatever else. But it's like nobody goes and calls, Joe Rogan schizophrenic, because he sits there and talks about having mass hallucinations where him and other people and see the same beings that is like machine elves like talking to them about things. But nobody's like, that's called schizophrenia. But maybe they're just not so sensitive as somebody who doesn't need DMT, like externally. I know it's found in your body naturally. So I don't know what schizophrenia is. I think that we don't understand it. I think we're wrong in that if we think that it just means that you're seeing things that aren't there. Doesn't make mathematical sense. But I also am not somebody who constantly experiences that either. I had like a few instances in my life of perceiving things that are abnormal like that, like a demon, like once. And it's not like I see demons everywhere. But there are probably people who can see demons all the time. And like that would be horrible. And it would be worse, honestly, if people told them that it wasn't true, if it was true. And why, we trust what we see. Why shouldn't they trust what they see as well? Just because we don't see it, that doesn't make sense either. There are animals that can perceive ultraviolet and we can't. Should we tell them, you're crazy, you're a schizophrenic bird because you think that bird has like this pattern on it and that pattern doesn't exist on that bird is just gray. It doesn't have that checkerboard pattern that you see because you can perceive ultraviolet. Like that, this doesn't, you don't get to pick and choose what to take seriously and what not to. You have to just work on contextualizing what is observed. And that doesn't mean that the context is always the same, but it means like, if I have snakes over there, okay, that Amazon tree boas and carpet pythons. Those snakes can see heat. They have the ability with heat pits that are on their lips to see infrared or to detect infrared and perceive it. I have snakes in that same, like, it's like a bunch of, it's like a rack of cages essentially that are king snakes. King snakes do not have the ability to perceive heat. But that means that those tree boas have a different view of the world than king snake. If you put them both in pitch black, that king snake will be like, there's nothing here. And, I mean, assuming it doesn't detect it with its sense of smell, essentially, smell. But those tree boas will be like, bro, there's a mouse. Like, I see it hiding in the corner. The king snake would be pretty stupid to be like, bro, you're just schizophrenic. There's no mouse. There's something causing an input to be perceived. It's not possible for inputs to happen without a reason. That doesn't mean every input is actually what it is perceived as being. It just means that there is an input. And because randomness is impossible, you can't just have one pop up out of nowhere. There's something causing it. And if it's a very detailed perception, it's probably not caused by some simple trigger. Like I don't know, like a neutrino going through you is not going to cause you to perceive a demon, probably. Like, it's probably seeing something that's, complicated. Joe Rogan is high as always. That doesn't matter. If multiple people are seeing the same thing when they're doing a DMT trip, which I don't recommend doing. I've never done DMT, but if you both do DMT and you both see the same machine elf and it tells you the same things, you saw something real. Okay? As real as it needs to be not just in your head. Even the things in your head, in your own mind alone, are not necessarily false. It just means they're not shared. And if they are shared, they do have an element of, it does add to their reality, I would say. The more shared something is, the more real it is. But if you're both seeing the same machine elf, like, it doesn't matter that you took DMT to see it. That's not an excuse. Why are you both seeing the same thing? Because there's something there. And there's probably no difference between these entities that people see when they do DMT and angels and demons. They're probably the exact same thing. It's just easier to see them when you're high on DMT. I appreciate your work. I appreciate you letting me know. People think you need to reach for an abstraction for truth, but it lies in simplicity. That's very true. Have you been hospitalized? No, I have never been hospitalized for anything that is cognitive. I broke my foot once. Does that count? Like, examine my arguments. If you're looking for evidence that I'm crazy, and you're like, have you ever been hospitalized? Have you ever been, have you ever been diagnosed with this or that? First of all, you're going to come up empty-handed, because I've never had any cognitive diagnoses of anything. Second, you're going to look foolish because my life doesn't reflect somebody who is not in touch with reality. Like, I've got my shit pretty much, like, I'm not perfect. I have plenty of things to figure out, but, I pay rent and I have a wife and dogs and job and, like, there's, like, I have career and personal and romantic and success. Like, doesn't mean that's only success. Life is hard, but there's no evidence for what you're looking for, is what I'm saying. Maybe just examine the logic of the argument. Like, that's what you should do. If you can't do that, then there's a problem with the way that you're thinking about this. You're looking for something specific because you have a goal, and that goal is not to understand. It's to frame, but in a specific frame that you've already chosen. You're not building the frame out based on what you see. You're trying to build me into a frame, and it's gonna fail. Got in trouble 2 years ago. Saw weird stuff. Well, I don't know exactly the details of that, but I hope that you got it worked out. I will say this, like, people who start to see more than what is normal do not think that you're crazy, but also recognize that not everybody can see what you can see. And that's okay. And you shouldn't feel upset because others can't see it. And I recognize that the inclination is to be upset and be like, well, I'm just trying to, like, get people to understand, and they don't. And, like, that, then you'll either be like, they're crazy or stupid, or I'm crazy. And none of those things is true. Like, people can see different things sometimes. And, some things are not meant for everybody to see. So, with that, I will call it Like I said, I like Brian Keating a lot. Big fan of his channel. I would call Brian a friend of mine. And I really admire Sabine for just being in the ring and being brave. And that is an increasingly rare trait among scientists, people in the academic scientific community today. And so you have to, those people are important. Even if I disagree very much with a lot of her statements, or I take issue with, I don't even want to say I disagree, but I take issue. I think that you should subscribe to both of their channels. If you want to watch the full stream that we discussed tonight, link is down in the description below. If you would like to join our weekly Discord call every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, where you can ask me any questions you want about any topic. It's usually a great group of people. It is a great group of people. And if you want the link to our Discord, just send me a private message on Instagram, either Theory of Everyone's Instagram or Tyler Marshall Goldstein Instagram, and I will send you the link. Just let me know that you want it, and you can join. There's lots of channels in there on all different topics, and then there's also, like I said, a weekly call. Please hit the like button if you have not, and you find this valuable or entertaining at all, or if you just feel, kind enough to support, this channel. If you haven't subscribed, please do. And if you'd like to sign up for my email list on sentientsingularity.com, you can. I don't think I've ever sent an email other than a welcome email, so you will not be spammed. But the reality of a theory of everything is that it eventually does have moral implications, and I guarantee you, as soon as we start talking about those, we will face the possibility of censorship and even, completely being shut down on YouTube. I hope not, but it's possible. But yeah, with that, how come you don't take super chats? I actually didn't realize I could. I probably can now because I have 1,000 subscribers, right? But that's a good point. I really appreciate that, Marco. I will be trying to do that next time. But that said, if you would like to monetarily contribute, because it does take a lot of time and even money and effort. I'm working on buying a new computer so that I can make videos that are not just live later this year. I do have a Patreon, and you can go there to make a monetary donation to this project if you think that it's valuable. I always appreciate that very much. So I don't have very many patrons, but I am extremely grateful for the ones that I have had. They have helped fund this project. I bought a camera with some of that money, and stands and all kinds of things. And I am working on a framework of benefits for patrons that is not what is currently on there. It will probably have to do with personal interaction, so like personal calls. So like if you want to have a personal discussion one-on-one with me, that isn't just the group call every week in our Discord, that would be like something that I think that will be on the Patreon tiers soon. Read my argument above. I don't think that temperament is a good sign of a good scientist. No, if you're going to just throw out ideas and smack people and run away and call for blocking and censorship and deletion of past streams and things like that, that is a destructive temperament, or those are destructive actions within like scientific pursuits. It doesn't matter. It's not a good argument to say it's not their area of expertise. What isn't their area of expertise? Backing up their argument? If Sean Carroll is going to make an entire lecture on why God is not a good theory, he is claiming that is his area of expertise by default. So you can't say that that's not his area of expertise. He's claiming it is. And it's perfectly fine to be like, you know what? Yeah, actually, this is beyond, at this point, this discussion is beyond my understanding, and I can't, participate in it further. That's fine. That's not the same as censorship. Blocking is censorship. Blocking outside of like harassment. Harassment, if somebody's harassing you, block them. Or like calling for streams to be taken down that, for reasons that are not about like issues with the stream. Like if you had technical issues, or I don't know, you both ended up behaving horribly and you both decide you want to take it down, and because of personal issues that were apparent on the stream, that I think is honestly fine too. I got on here pretty angry once because I had been blocked and I was live, and I'd been blocked right as I went live, and one person was on here and I was just like, I think I just was pissed. It was like 30 seconds of me being pissed, and I was like, you know what, guys, I'll be back in 5 minutes. I've got to restart and cool off. That's fine. That's different than being like, that guy beat me, or I think that guy's political issues are insulting or like wrong, or that guy doesn't have a PhD, so therefore I'm going to block them, or want any engagements that I've had with them taken down, or things like that. That is wrong. It's fine to say, you know what, I never want to engage with that person again, or I think that their rebuttal was wrong, or I don't like them as a person, so I'm going to choose not to engage with them personally, but I'm going to engage with their ideas. Like, that's all fine. But to be like, we're not going to say this person's name, we're going to delete previous streams because of political reasons, or even personal reasons. Like, if it's not about the content and the debate itself, then like there's no justification for taking it down. There's no justification for blocking somebody just because they beat your logic. Like, that doesn't make sense. It does make sense if you're valuing personal image and comfort above the seeking of truth. But if you are that type of person, get out of science. I hope I addressed your argument. But with that, thank you guys. Like I said, hit the like button, and if I can turn on super chats next week, I will try that. But I appreciate everybody here. Peace.